Here we are in photosynthesis part 3, and here we're going to dive a little deeper into the actual mechanisms of photosynthesis, from absorption of light to the actual production of carbohydrates. Remember that photosynthesis is a reduction reaction, reduction of carbon dioxide to glucose or carbohydrates. And since it's a reduction reaction, it's endergonic and it's going to take energy in, and that energy is actually from the form of light energy. So remember from our last screencast that photosynthesis occurs in two main parts. We have the light reactions that involve the absorption of light and are dependent on the absorption of light, where they're going to convert the solar energy into energy products, ATP molecules, and this electron carrier, NADPH, which can be used then, both of these can be used into the Calvin cycle, which is the carbon fixation cycle. The light reactions take place in the thylakoid membrane, and the Calvin cycle is going to take place in the stroma of the chloroplast. In photosynthesis, we've got two photosystems that are found in the thylakoid membrane. A photosystem is a multi-protein complex with otherwise known as light harvesting complexes, but they're chlorophyll molecules that are arranged into these protein molecules, and they're proteins with the chlorophylls inside. And there's a primary reaction center basically in the middle that is going to accept electrons. So when photons of light hit any of these molecules, they're going to be passed from molecule to molecule until they reach the main or primary reaction center. So it's important to know that actually photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, they occur together. They don't compete with one another. They work synergistically, and they just use different wavelengths. And we'll talk about photosystem 2 first, and actually these just have to do with the order in which they were discovered by scientists. The photosystems involve two places where light actually is absorbed and where it's going to hit those photosystems, where they're going to hit the chloroplasts. And of course, all of these, the cells are just being bombarded, the plant leaves are being bombarded with photons and wavelengths of light constantly. And so we're just going to talk about when and what happens when the photon of light is going to hit a photosystem. So we'll look at this in more detail, but we're now looking at, of course, the thylakoid membrane here from inside of the chloroplasts. We're talking about the electron transport of photosynthesis, and this would be the photosystem 2 as a part of the light reactions in photosynthesis inside of a chloroplast. And a photon of light strikes the pigment in the light harvesting complex, or in the PS2 here. And what that does is it boosts an electron into a higher energy level. That's what the sunlight does. It has enough energy to excite or lift an electron into a higher energy level. Because these molecules lost electrons by being excited by the light that strikes them and excites them to a higher energy level, they're going to need to replace these electrons. And what happens is that a water is going to be split by an enzyme. It's going to be split, and therefore it's going to kind of replace those electrons that can then be excited later. But the oxygen here, if we move it over here, the oxygen is actually going to be diffused out of the cell here so that we can breathe it in. The hydrogens are actually, that come from the splitting of the water, are going to be built up, and there's going to be a proton gradient, and we'll come back to that proton or that hydrogen gradient again, because remember that in the thylakoid, as they move outside of the thylakoid into that stroma, we're actually going to use our old friend ATP synthase to harvest ATP molecules from that potential energy, from that falling energy of the proton gradient by chemiosmosis. And we'll revisit that later. So these electrons in the electron transport are going to be passed from electron acceptor to electron acceptor to electron acceptor, and they're actually going to be, could be thought of as falling. And again, these hydrogens are going to, that come from this, are going to be contributing to our proton gradient. And that exergonic fall of electrons to a lower energy level here provides energy for the synthesis of ATP. As electrons pass through these complexes, they're going to fall to a lower energy level, and that's going to provide energy for the synthesis of the ATP. So as electrons pass through these complexes, the hydrogens are going to be pumped into the thylakoid space, but that's going to contribute to this proton gradient that we talked about before, and then we can use them in chemiosmosis. Meanwhile, this electron, the light energy has been transferred to the light harvesting complexes of photosystem 1 as that electron falls back here, and energized by light energy, an electron is going to be again excited, sent to a higher energy state. So this second shot of light energy is going to excite the electron back up to that high energy state, and the second electron transport chain is going to drive the reduction of NADP into NADPH, which is going to be electron carrier. So the light comes in at 2 points, and we're going to produce both ATP and we're going to produce NADPH. Remember that NADPH is like money in the bank. We're going to have that reducing power that will come back again, much like in cell respiration. But the ATP and these electron carriers are going to be sent off to the Calvin cycle, where with the introduction of carbon dioxide, we'll be able to build up carbohydrates. So we're back to taking a bigger look at this process. Here's our photosystem 2, where light is going to stimulate, photons of light are going to stimulate the reaction centers here, and electrons, they get boosted to higher energy states, which it doesn't really show here, but they're going to get passed from complex to complex to complex. And all the while as that's doing this, we're going to be harvesting these protons that are going to build up in the thylakoid space here. And of course, the water's been split by an enzyme and contribute to this proton, building the proton gradient. Of course, that oxygen, it's going to diffuse out of the cell eventually and be released by the plant so that we can breathe that gas. And when the electrons get to photosystem 1, with more energy from the sun, this is going to be again used to be in kind of a second part of the electron transport, and we're going to be able to produce our electron carrier and some ATP that's going to be shifted off to the Calvin cycle. Because remember, with the use of ATP synthase, this proton gradient is going to be like water falling over a dam to turn a little turbine, and we can harvest that as ATP. So take a moment here just to review the electron transport chain of photosynthesis and the events that occur, the major events that occur in these steps. So it's interesting to talk about maybe where the oxygen comes from that plants release. And I know you've heard that people breathe in oxygen, release carbon dioxide, and maybe even heard it stated in such a way that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. Of course, we know that's not true, but it's not even just a simple exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And science figured this out by using a radioactive isotope of oxygen, oxygen 18, and what they did, they were able to tag the oxygen in these different compounds. So they basically set up an experiment, tagged the oxygen in water, and found out that that's the oxygen that was also tagged from the carbon dioxide gas. When they tried to tag the oxygen in carbon dioxide, that tag, radioactive tracer, showed up in the carbohydrate, glucose, and not in the oxygen. Therefore, we know it's not just a simple carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange. So what we just discussed and what we looked at is called noncyclic phosphorylation, or noncyclic electron flow. And this involves both the photosystems 1 and the Photosystems 2, where an electron from the photosystem 1 is actually used and accepted by NADP to produce an NADPH. Also, ATP is going to be produced, and water is going to be split or oxidized to produce O2. But one photosystem is not enough. That's why we need both of them. And you have to lift the electron in 2 stages to a higher energy level so that it can do more work as it falls. So first we produce ATP, but ATP is not enough. We have to end up producing organic molecules as well as these electron carriers, so that later on in the Calvin cycle we have a storage molecule in the form of sugars, so that plants also have energy for their own use or to pass it on to other organisms. So this picture might look pretty complex, or the things might look pretty complex that we've talked about, but we want to keep track of the big picture. The light reactions use solar power to generate ATP and NADPH. So that'll provide chemical energy and reducing power, respectively, to the carbohydrate making reactions of the Calvin cycle. With cyclic phosphorylation or cyclic electron flow, if photosystem 1 can't pass the electron, it cycles back to PS2 and it makes more ATP. But here it doesn't make any electron transport. So it coordinates light reactions to the Calvin cycle, and then we can use the Calvin cycle to make more ATP than NADPH. But the important part is that we don't have this kind of money in the bank for later on. But in the Calvin cycle, we really want to make sure that we have enough energy to produce and store in the carbohydrates that are produced. So this Z scheme of the blue line here that you see describes the path of electrons as they travel through both or 2 photosystems. And the next step in the process is the carbon fixation reactions. And these require way more ATP than just the NADPH. So if the pathway, the non-cyclic pathway, were the only set of light reactions going on, there might not be sufficient ATP for the carbon fixation. So cyclic electron transport makes up for the imbalance. This pathway uses only photosystem 1 and produces ATP, but not NADPH. So it's cyclic because an electron is passed from excited chlorophyll and then recycles back to the exact same chlorophyll. So photosynthesis, just looking at the light reactions here, you should stop this, be able to ask yourself these questions, and review each of them before we talk about carbon fixation in the Calvin cycle. Answers are coming up. You sure you don't want to pause? Here you go. Easy, right? Obviously. Keep the big picture in mind. In the light reactions, what does water do? How does it what happens to electrons that get excited? And where does each of the compounds we've talked about come from, and where do they go?